Welcome to our presentation. Our topic for today is the lives of former slaves after emancipation and the impact of the Jim Crow laws in the United States. We will show you how slavery officially ended in 1865, but that freedom was followed by almost a century of systemic racism, poverty, and legal segregation. Moreover, we will have a look at the daily lives of Black Americans, the rise of the Jim Crow laws, and the fight for justice that began long before the civil rights movements in the 1960s. Let's have a look at our outline first. First, Sarah is going to tell you about the emancipation and the end of slavery. Then I'm going on with the economic condition of freed slaves. Next, we have the daily life, so housing, education, and healthcare. We will also be discussing the emergence of the Jim Crow laws, so where they came from and how they were enforced. But to understand these laws better, we will have a look at the origins of the term Jim Crow and how it became a symbol of institutionalized racism. After that, we will talk about segregation in practice. Next, we have the disenfranchisement and voter suppression. Towards the end, I will highlight early forms of resistance and civil rights efforts that began during these times. And finally, we will conclude with a reflection on what freedom actually meant in the absence of full equality. And we will share our sources at the end as well.
Let's start with the emancipation and the end of slavery. In 1865, after the American Civil War and slavery officially ended, the 13th Amendment made it illegal. More than 4 million enslaved African Americans were free now, but this freedom came without land, money, or support. Many didn't know how to go or where to live. In the South, many white people were very angry and made new laws called Black Code to control the life of black people. The law limited their freedom and their rights. One example of Black Code was in Mississippi in 1865. Black people had to sign work contracts for 1 year. If they didn't, they could be arrested for vagrancy and forced to work without pay. So even after slavery ended, they were still controlled by unfair law. The historian Eric Forner said, "Emancipation frees the body, but not the future." So even so, slavery ended, real equality was still far away.
So, while freedom was declared, the question remained: how would these millions of freed people would survive? For that, I will now take a closer look at their economic reality after emancipation. After emancipation, many former slaves hoped to earn a land or earn a living, but only a few of them received any land or any help from the government. Instead, they were forced to a system called sharecropping. That meant working on a white landowner's farm in exchange for the harvest. On paper, this might seem fair, but in reality, it was a cycle of debt and exploitation. They had to borrow tools, seeds, and food and pay for it out of their crop. The system was designed to keep Black Americans and Black families dependent and poor. W.E.B. Du Bois said, "They were free, but with no land, no tools, no education, nothing." So, economic freedom was still far away.
Let's talk about the daily life, especially the housing, education, and healthcare. The life for Black Americans after slavery was very hard. The most lived in poor areas without clean water, toilets, or public services. They were allowed to go to school, but the school for Black children had less money, fewer teachers, and old books. All in all, in white school was everything better. Healthcare was also unfair. Some hospitals didn't even treat white people, or they had to go to separate and worse rooms. But with all these problems, Black people built their own church, schools, and support groups. These gave them strength, hope, and a sense of pride.
Yeah, so despite building strong communities, Black Americans soon faced a new threat: legal segregation. I will now show you how the Jim Crow laws came into being. By the 1870s and 1880s, white leaders in the South began to formalize legal segregation through what we now call the Jim Crow laws. These were laws that legally separated Black and white people in public spaces, so schools, transportations, restaurants, theaters, bathrooms, and even cemeteries. The name Jim Crow came from a racist minstrel show character that mocked black people. Then these laws were enforced by the police, judges, and violent mobs. The Supreme Court supported segregation in 1896 with the decision Plessy v. Ferguson, which introduced the principle of separate but equal. Of course, it was never equal. The goal was to make black Americans into second-class citizens.
Let's talk about the origins of Jim Crow. Before Jim Crow was the name of racist law, it was the name of a stage character. In 1828, a white actor named Thomas D. Wright painted his face black and performed a song named Jim Crow. He acted in a way that made fun of how black people talked and moved. These shows were called minstrel shows. They were very popular but very racist. They showed black people as stupid or lazy. Later, the name Jim Crow was used to describe the law that separated black and white people. So racism was not just in the law, but also in entertainment. It made racism seem normal to many people. Now we show you an aspect of a minstrel show.
I'm a wheel about a Jim Crow. I went down to the river. I didn't mean to stay, but there I saw so many gals I couldn't get away. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about a Jim Crow. Give me that more clothes, please. And so it was that a young song and dance man, who was later belovedly known as Daddy Wright, was the first to bring blackface characterization to the American stage.
Yeah. So, as we have seen, racism wasn't just written in law, it was also embedded in the culture. But how does this actually affect daily life under Jim Crow? I will now walk us through segregation in practice. Under Jim Crow, black people faced daily humiliation. Public places were strictly segregated. For example, there were white water fountains, waiting rooms, and even bus seats. Even schools and hospitals were divided. If a black person enters a white space, they could risk a violence or arrest. In some cases, even looking at a white person the wrong way could result in being beaten or lynched. These laws weren't just about separation, they were about domination and control. It was a way for white society to say, "You are not equal, you do not belong." And it wasn't just law, it became deeply ingrained in social behavior and everyday life.
Now I talk about the disenfranchisement and the voter suppression. The 15th Amendment says that black men have the right to vote. This seems great, right? But in the South, states made new rules to stop them. One rule was the poll tax. People had to pay money to vote. Most black families were very poor, so they couldn't afford it. Another rule was the literacy test. Black people had to read and explain a hard part of the law. The tests were often made impossible to pass, even for educated people. There was also the grandfather clause. You could only vote if your grandfather had voted, but the most black people's grandfather had been slaves and couldn't vote, so this rule educated them too. These rules were not about fairness. They were made to take away the voice of black Americans in politics. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Give us the ballot and we will transform the South." But for almost 100 years, many black Americans were not allowed to vote.
Yeah, so even with so many obstacles, black Americans never gave up the fight. I will now show you how resistance began and how early leaders led the groundwork for change. So, despite all this oppression, black Americans never stopped fighting back. They used the courts, the press, the church, and education to resist. One key figure here was E.W. Wells, a journalist who exposed the horrors of lynching. In 1909, the NAACP, so the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was founded. This organization worked to fight segregation through legal battles and public campaigns. Another key leader was W.E.B. Du Bois, who demanded full equality and civil rights, not just gradual progress. These early civil rights efforts laid the foundation for larger movements that would came in the 1950s and 60s. And here you can see E.W. Wells, the journalist I just talked about.
To the end, let's look our conclusion. Freedom without land, freedom without equality. To end, slavery was over in 1865, but racism continued. Black Americans still faced poverty, unfair laws, and daily disrespect. The fight for justice began long before the 1960s. Many people don't know this part of history, but it's important to understand. The effects of slavery and Jim Crow law are still felt today. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Justice so long delayed is justice denied." That's why it's important to learn this history, because it helps explain the problem we still see today. These are our sources, these are our other sources.
Yeah, thank you for listening. Bye.